What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? He asked it to the barn because the house answered back with photographs. Frost edged the feed buckets. The hay smelled like old summers and sorrow. Wind threaded the rafters with a patient hand. It was November. The world made thin and precise. He moved through stalls as if rehearsing a life. Sweep, pitch, check water. His hands did the work, his voice could not. Small acts are the polite lie grief lets you tell yourself. I am useful. No one asked him to return. He came because the horses would not let the world forget. Before he saw the animal, he felt it. A weight in the dark, the way light bends around muscle. The stall held a presence. When he stepped in, the horse turned, deliberate. It was black like ink, mane loose, one eye half hidden by hair, the other wide and quiet, measuring him. He reached into his pocket and felt the edge of a photograph. A laugh, a sunlight patch where a head had stood, and let it rest there like a small heat. He stopped at the threshold and breathed. Hay. Warm breath, a faint copper of medicine. The horse breathed back. He did not speak. Words were blunt instruments. He offered his hand, palm down. The horse sniffed, nostrils working like instruments, then touched the cuff of his sleeve with a cool, searching press. The contact landed on a hollow part of his chest he hadn't known existed. His fingers trembled, not from fear but because the animal trusted him enough to ask. A pale scar ran along the horse's lip. He traced it with his thumb without thinking. The animal's eyes softened as if asking, stay or go. He sat on a bale and let the barn's silence answer. The horse lowered its head just beyond his knees, the weight of it a sober punctuation to the sentence his life had become. He started bringing small things, a clean blanket, a cracked halter, a bowl scrubbed thin. The horse accepted each with nudges and slow blinks, gestures that felt like conversation. It would prick its ears at the sound of a distant truck and tilt its head at an empty patch of ground where something important had happened. Once, in a blue afternoon, it pawed and found a mud-soft, torn corner of paper. He picked it up and saw handwriting his skin remembered before his mind did. Night turned the barn into a theater of small lights. He slept above the tack and woke to the horse's snort in the blue hours. The animal took up a kind of watchfulness he hadn't known he needed. It whickered when weather threatened and pawed when the moon tilted like an accusation. It learned the length of his silences and matched them. The woman who ran the place warned him not to make promises to an animal he might not keep. He smiled and said he wasn't making promises. He was making room. She watched him with eyes that had catalogued many kinds of sorrow and nodded. Their bond wasn't theatrical. There were no miracles. Some mornings the horse would refuse to move, and he would wait in the rain until it decided. In that waiting, he learned a patient grammar, how to be present without pressing, how to let trust arrive in inches. The horse taught him to be small again, to accept that decisions take time. People asked why he stayed. He had no tidy answer. He began taking the long way into town, so the drive became a buffer between errands and the stall's night. He mended fences he meant to ignore, and washed boots he had avoided. These were small things that anchored him. One bruised afternoon, leathering dusk to the color of old wounds, he rose to leave. Plans waited in the city. Papers, calls, the machinery of grief. The horse followed. It took one quiet step, not a call or a stamp, but a single motion that closed the distance between two lives. He could have closed the stall and driven away. He had reasons to go. He turned once, a half glance over his shoulder, and caught the animal looking at him with the same cautious hope he felt. Outside the windows, wine pressed its cold face to the glass. Inside, the barn held its breath. He didn't know if the horse remembered the person who'd owned it, or only felt the emptiness like a draft. He only knew the step. The answer to the question he'd asked at the beginning. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Shifted from a riddle into a decision that felt, for the first time, like possibility. He took his coat off and laid it over the stall door. The horse nosed the fabric, then rested its nose on his palm. The contact was simple, precise, and enormous. It didn't promise to fix facts. It didn't pretend the past would return. It promised, in the animal's patient currency, something quieter. company for the dark hours, a shoulder that would not leave. When he closed the door that night, he did it with the strange lightness of someone carrying one fewer thing he had to carry alone. But even as he walked up the lane toward the small light of the farmhouse, the thought that kept returning was not tidy or solved. It sat like a small stone in his pocket, too insistent to ignore. Why had the horse taken that one step after him? That question hung in the crisp air as the barn exhaled behind him. Some nights he dreamed simpler scenes. A door slam, a laugh stuck at the edge of sleep. In the mornings he talked about small errands, and the horse listened, ear tilted like a careful neighbor. Once a song came from the farmhouse radio, and the animal shifted, muzzle to hay, as if remembering a tune only it could fetch. Those little recognitions felt like fragments of someone else's kindness returned to him through the horse's body. He began to measure time in moments of trust, a nudge, a shared quiet, a night warmed against the animal's flank. Still, the why of the horse's step after him remained a hard, bright question, for now. He started keeping the stall door unlatched the day he found the name. It was the kind of thing that should have been small. A tucked scrap of leather, a bit of a halter frayed where a maker's stamp had once been. He found it by accident, behind a bale where light made its own proof of dust. The name was carved into the leather in a slow, careful hand. M. Carter. His chest tightened the way a trap tightens around a finger. He remembered that name like a bruise under skin he'd stopped touching. For days after, the horse behaved like a page reading itself aloud but skipping lines. It would stand at particular fences, ears tilted toward a slope behind the orchard, staring as if a shape used to live there. It flinched at the scent of diesel from the farm truck and then settled, as if listening for a voice that had once spoken. It. Once, when he walked past with a saddle, the animal stamped its foot and turned its head toward the farmhouse, nostrils flaring as if it could smell a person who had been gone for years. He tried to keep his mornings tidy, coffee, feed, tack. But the leather scrap had opened something he had thought closed. The house kept yielding photographs like small accusations. A man with a grin gone soft in the corner of a frame. A hand, on the horse's flank, fingers pressing names into muscle memory. Somewhere, the facts had been tidy. A name, a departure, a trailer crash that filled a county paper for a week. But the way grief arranges truth is rarely tidy. It lists under the wrong heading. He felt the edges of the story, smelled the smoke, on the words, but the center remained opaque. He began to pay attention to the horse's oddities. It would refuse the gate leading to the road on certain afternoons, then walk willingly when he rattled a handful of oats into his palm. It disliked the smell of a woolen hat he sometimes wore, the hat that had once belonged to the person who was no longer there, and would push against his shoulder when it came near the stall. One evening, while he held the hat and watched the animal from the feed room, the horse pressed its forehead against the hat as if testing a memory. There was a small, private cruelty in learning the world through a horse's habits. The animal could not say why its body tightened at a certain noise, or why it warmed at a certain touch. It only enacted the differences. He read them like telegraph signals. Each gesture was a map with missing roads. Then, the other shoe fell. He found the letter in a tack trunk that hadn't been opened in months, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp from its edges. The handwriting was the same as on the leather. Sure, slanted, with a habit of pulling loops too long. The letter was folded twice and contained a promise that had been written in an afternoon of clean light. A promise to meet, to travel, to start anew. It had never been mailed. The ink had browned where rain had kissed it. He sat on the trunk and let the letter fall open like a hinge. The words were not dramatic. They were small and domestic. Remember the stall at dusk, bring the old blanket. Don't forget to laugh at the way Prince, the horse's name in the letter, will try to steal your sandwich. The voice in the letter was intimate, ordinary, and that ordinariness was what hit him hardest. It killed the idea that the person had been only a headline. Here was someone who had spoken to the future in ordinary terms and had been answered by silence. The breaking was not cinematic. It arrived as a slow unspooling. He felt his body go damp at the temples, fingers gripping the paper as if it might move. He walked out to the stall because moving felt safer than not moving. The horse watched him approach, the hairs along its neck lifting in the cold like a fringe of watchful grief. When he read a line aloud, A clumsy lift of sound to see whether the world would confirm. The animal lowered its head and rested it on the wooden partition near his knee. He did not sob at first. Sobbing is a thing of bodies that have room for it. He breathed and let the silence do the work. Tears came anyway, wet and patient. They spilled onto the carnet of the man's words and onto his own palms. The horse stayed. It pressed its nose against his shoulder, then nudged the paper with a soft, ceremonious touch, as if it meant to remind him that the past had weight, and that weight could be carried, sometimes, by another's steadiness. People who do not live with horses imagine theatrics, runs beneath storm clouds, sudden understandings like light bulbs. What happened instead was quieter. The animal learned the pitch of his grief and matched it. It would stand at his side when letters arrived, breathing slow, the lavender of its breath fogging the winter air. It would let him cry into its mane. Once, when he could not stop shaking, the horse braced its body against his knees in a way that felt almost like lending him structure. He began to talk to the horse about the small things. He read the unsent letter aloud, line by line, like a prayer without clergy. He told it about the way the man had taught him to ride across fields, about jokes that had no audience now except wind. The horse listened the way living creatures listen, with a kind of unassuming presence. No interpretation, just company. Weeks folded into months, and space opened in the shape of their routines. The barn became a room that held two people's echoes. He slept in the chair by the stall sometimes, listening to the horses chewing, and in the hours before dawn learned that it would stand and watch until he fell asleep. He mended the frayed halter and stitched the torn blanket the man had once loved. Repair felt like liturgy. Each stitch was an offering. The transformation was not a bright cure but a gradual settling. The edges of his days softened. He stopped measuring time only by loss and began measuring it by returns. The horse's insistence on following him to the gate some mornings. The way it would find the exact place the man used to lean and breathe there, as if proof that a body had once been. He found himself laughing at small things. How the horse would try to steal potatoes off the counter if he left the door unlatched. And the laugh surprised him with its ease. There was a final small gift, almost absurd in its ordinariness. One spring, when the sun turned the barn's dust into gold, the horse led him down a slope he had never walked. It stopped at the edge of a meadow where wildflowers had started like small flags. There, half buried under a clump of roots, he found a tin box. Inside were photographs, grainy, joyful, a man with his arm over the horse's neck, and a note that read, "For the roads we didn't take, keep his coffee hot and his laugh ready." It was not a revelation that fixed everything. It was a hinge. The photographs were a kind of proof that the person had been more than an absence. They had been an imperfect, ridiculous, earnest presence. He sat on the grass and let the sun read him lines of heat. The horse stood over him, nose nudging his hand, solid as a phrase. Months from the first night when the stall door had been left unlatched, he noticed a quiet change in himself. He could walk into the town and return without the ache that once tightened his ribs like wire. The house still had ghosts in the frame of the doorway, but they were no longer the only inhabitants. The animal had not replaced the man. It had made room for the man to exist differently, as memory that could be held alongside a life still lived. On an evening when the sky remembered a color that had not been used in years, he smoothed the horse's flank and felt the animal inhale, slow and deep. He thought about the questions he had asked the barn months ago and how different the answers sounded now. The mystery had not vanished. It had shifted into something like faith, that another living body could take the edge off loneliness simply by being there. Sometimes, when dusk blurred the horizon and insects stitched the air, he would stand in the doorway watching the horse move like a lyric. He would say the man's name into the dark, not to call him back but to anchor himself in what had been real. The horse would lift its head, ears alert, listening to the syllables as if they were a melody only it could place. If this quiet story touched something inside you, please subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon so you can be here for the next story that just might change your heart. If you stayed to the end, thank you. Come back tomorrow and we'll sit in the barn together again and listen.